Hi, my name is Juliet, and I'm the creator and host of Connecting the Dots podcast. I love ideas and problem solving, and my career in communication has led me down a path of curiosity. Why we do what we do, how we tell better stories, and how African scientists solve everyday problems. Join me on this enlightening and entertaining exploration of African science like you've never experienced before. Get ready to laugh, learn, and be inspired. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Connecting the Dots podcast. I am joined by Dr. Bediako. Bediako is a Ghanaian immunologist and biotech entrepreneur. He obtained a PhD from Northwest University in the US and a postdoctoral in Kenya and the UK. As the pandemic took center stage, in 2020, Yao co-founded Yemachi Biotech to develop new testing tools and drug targets for cancer. In 2021, Yao received the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Callistus Juma Science Leadership Fellowship and is a fellow of Ghana's Young Academy. And in 2022, he was recognized as one of the top 40 under 40 Yao business people in Ghana. And in January of 2023, he was selected as one of the 100 most influential Africans by New African magazine. A self-described wannabe golfer and a citizen of Kenya only during the Olympics. So yeah, I can see your passport comes with athletics. We are very excited to have this special guest with us today. Karibu, Daktari Akwaba.
Asante, thank you very much. It's nice to be here.
So Yao, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background. We're interested to really understand, what are your fondest memories from childhood that has led you into this professional career and person that you are today?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me on Connecting the Dots. It's great to be here and to share a bit about my story and about Yemachi. So as you said in the bio, I'm a life scientist. You said fondest memories. So I guess going back to childhood, I grew up in an academic home. Both my parents were professors, though not in science, but in the humanities. But grew up school was very important. Academics was very important. But perhaps more importantly, I would say Africa was very important. My dad was a Pan-Africanist. He believed in African excellence, and he believed in Africans charting their own path. He rejected the narrative that Africa was somehow inferior or lesser than the West. In his field of theology, there was a lot of that sort of seeming, I could call it disparity or imbalance. And he was one of the champions for Africa's role in defining theological thought. And so as a young boy and then as a young man watching my dad, and actually with support from my mom, I should add, build their careers and build an institute actually in Ghana, I really wanted to do something similar. I wanted to build something. So, many fond memories, but really I think besides all the stuff you mentioned in the bio, the thing that I think really defines me as a person is my unyielding belief in Africa's potential, but also my recognition that that potential can only be realized if Africans do it for themselves and are willing to work extra hard in order to do so.
So why do we have the title Dr. Yao Bediako, not Reverend Yao Bediako? Why the sciences?
It's funny enough, as a young boy, I wanted to be a reverend. My dad was a reverend professor. I wanted to be a reverend. I wanted to do theology and French like he did. Like most young boys, I idolized my father. But as I got into high school, I found I enjoyed science. And that love for science continued into my university. I went to a liberal arts school, Calvin College in the US. So I took philosophy, I took history. I did well in those subjects. I enjoyed it. I think there was a time when organic chemistry was really difficult and I almost switched to a philosophy major. But I really enjoyed science and I enjoyed the act of research. And I think that is probably why I stuck to science. The research, I didn't want to go to medical school. I wasn't excited about the prospect of working in a hospital in the traditional sense. But research, being able to discover something new, which is what my parents were doing in their field, but now my interest was science, really excited me. And I was fortunate to have mentors at every stage from undergraduate throughout my postdoc who took who took an interest and poured something into me. So where I am today is not just a feature, or really it's less about what I've done, but I think I can point to every stage of my life, my academic career. There's been one or two key people who didn't have to, but decided to invest in that scrawny kid from Ghana. And I think that is why I am where I am today, and that's why I'm Dr. Bediako, immunologist. It's that curiosity about science that I couldn't kick.
So when we were doing some research and background checks on you, just to understand what your background has been, and understanding that, you have traveled the world, seen the world, been in a lot of places. I think at some point you mentioned 20 years out of the continent and then coming back into the continent. So for you, what is the problem with Africa's science or research ecosystem that has led you to becoming this biotech entrepreneur and the co-founder of Yamachi?
Well, as I said, I was determined, linking back to what I said about my father, I was really determined that my career should mean something in Africa. I was not a theologian, I was not a philosopher, I was a scientist. Okay, what does that mean for African science? And my initial focus was academia, because that's what I knew, that's where I was trained, that's what I grew up in. And so my dream was to be a professor as quickly as I could. My dream was to be a professor before I was 45. I wanted to perhaps have an institute, because my dad had an institute, so I thought, well, I'd start an institute. And it was very academic in focus. When I returned to Ghana fully in sort of 2018, 2019 to the University of Ghana, that was still my dream. And I was fortunate once again to find somebody in Professor Gordon Awandare, who was a mentor, who was not that much older than me. I mean, he'd achieved a lot, and I could see, okay, if I follow that path, that's kind of he's who I want to be when I grow up. But that changed slightly. I still am very affiliated. I'm very affiliated with WACBIP, and I still have lots of great interactions with Prof. Awandare, but I began to see my own path shift a little bit in terms of where I wanted to go. And the key thing was I felt we needed more than academia. I didn't have that realization before I came back, but once I was in academia in Africa and I was surrounded by the scientific ecosystem, it was very clear to me that as much as we had made great strides in building capacity for training, we were not really building the capacity. We're not finishing the equation. We were not balancing the equation, because we were training young people, but we're not asking ourselves where would they work. And really the only option for them is typically in academia, which to me should not be the end result. You don't train PhDs to end up just teaching at universities.
Yeah,
you need some to teach, or you need others to do something else. And it was that something else that I felt Africa lacked. So if you ask me what is missing in the African ecosystem, in a word, it's industry. In a word, it is jobs. In a word, it is high-paying jobs to retain your best talent. And all of that is summed up in industry. I don't think industry is all that we need. We certainly do need academia, so we need a strong academia, but we need an academia that is self-funded. By self-funded, I mean African-funded. And so Africa needs to generate money to fund its science. And if I look at the US, I look at Europe, yes, governments provide some funding, but 75% of the money that supports science in the US is actually from the private sector. And Africa lacks that. So we need an African scientific industry. And without it, all our capacity building efforts, in my opinion, to be honest, will ultimately be in vain.
But then do you feel that on the continent we have enough of those private sectors to be able to contribute to industry?
No, we don't. I mean, we have hardly any. Which is why I decided, at least let's try. My attempt to maybe not solve it. It would be too, I'm not going to be that arrogant to say that Yamachi is going to solve Africa's industry issues, but at least we have to start somewhere. So yeah, Africa does not have much of an industry, and that's what makes it so difficult.
Yeah.
But you start somewhere, you put one step in front of the other. And the dream is I will look back 10, 15, at the end of my career, when I hang up the boots and kind of sit down and hopefully relax, I can look back and say, when we started, there wasn't much. When we finished, there was some. And there are a lot more young people who are going to blaze the trail, who I can see. And so I can see that promised land. hopefully taste it a little bit in my time. But really, it's about seeing that Africa is now on that footing where we are building a more sustainable and well-rounded ecosystem.
It almost feels like you are a unicorn, given the fact that, you're almost treading a path less trodden, if I can say that. And I'm just interested to understand, as a researcher, you're trained in research, refused to go the theological direction, went into training to do research, and suddenly you're an unexpected, I'm tempted to call you an accidental CEO, but that would not be doing justice to all the work and effort and intentionality that has come into you establishing Yamachi. So I'm interested, as a researcher, what are the lessons, you've had to learn? Because now you're going into business. It's completely different field, a different mammoth. What are the tips, a young person listening to you, what are the tips you'd give them, struggling into now industry, into setting up a company that's going to be competitive? We've called you the private biotech, a crucial, element that's needed in the research ecosystem in the continent. So what are the elements for you that you would speak to?
Well, I think first of all, everybody's path will be different. And I think you have to be very careful to overly model yourself off of somebody. Somebody's success, the way they did it, doesn't mean it's the only way.
Right.
But certainly the lessons I have learned, the first one, and I hinted to this before, was I didn't know anything about a business. And yes, I have a PhD, but PhD is in immunology. It's not in business.
Yeah.
And so you need a healthy dose of humility and self-reflection. You need to be critical. You need to be your worst critic. And I think this applies not just to business. I think it applies to science. I try to communicate that to my students. I still do a bit of teaching at the university. When I talk to masters or PhD students at WACBIP, I tell them you need to be your biggest critic. Do not let someone else reveal weaknesses in you that you do not know already. And I think sometimes it's a temptation that we know we're a little bit weak in something, but we are a little bit in denial about it, and we try to paper over it. You will be revealed. The situation will reveal those weaknesses. So you don't just identify them and sit down. You identify them and you work on them. And so I very early on realized that if I was going to start a business, I needed to get as much advice as I could. And so I cast a wide net. I asked people, I actually prioritized people who are not scientists, just people who are business people, and said, look, sanity check this idea for me. Like, I want to start a biotech. This is what I'd like to do. Why is it a bad idea? Why is it a stupid idea? And then gradually, Yamachi evolved. So the Yamachi I began with in my head is very different from the Yamachi that I started with. And then once you're on the journey, you continue to evolve. So Yamachi today is way better than the Yamachi the vision I started with, but it's better because we've learned. So I think flexibility, humility, being ready to learn. But the one thing I will say is having, my encouragement to life science PhDs like myself is your brain can do a lot more than you think it can. That PhD training was not just to make you good at pipetting or doing some lab experiments.
Yeah.
It builds an ability to think critically that a very small proportion of the population have. A good PhD stretches you in ways that you didn't know you could be stretched. But once that happens, if you apply yourself, you can do things that you didn't think you could do. And so I think there's actually an opportunity for PhDs to do more entrepreneurship than they know, because you have that ability to pick up a document and read it, assimilate it very quickly, analyze it, and respond. It comes almost naturally to you because you had to do that to survive your PhD. Now you can take that and read a business document as opposed to a science document, and the same skills will translate. So I think it's about finding those areas where your skills and your training translate into business, but then also being ready to really get into the classroom, as it were, and sit at the feet of people who know what they're doing and learn.
So let's zoom into Yamachi, and why you established Yamachi. And then I want you to talk a little bit about the AMBER study, So maybe tell us, what was the question or what was the problem you were trying to solve or are trying to solve with Yamachi, the discoveries of diagnostics, testing tools, drugs for cancer. Why?
Well, it's interesting. I'll answer it sort of in a slightly different direction, linked to what we've been talking about. So Yamachi is a life science company focused on leveraging Africa's genetic diversity to improve precision oncology, so improve the way cancer is treated globally. Now, I'm an immunologist. I'm a basic immunologist. I started off with infectious disease, but I began to develop an interest in cancer, partly because I lost my father to cancer, but also because the more I looked around, every friend of mine in Africa had some connection to cancer. Either they were a survivor, their parents had cancer. In fact, one of my co-founders lost both his parents to cancer. So it's like everywhere you go, cancer is this problem. But when you look at our research, it's malaria, HIV, TB. Now, those are important. I'm not disparaging them. I spent much of my postdoc career studying malaria. But Africa has more problems than just infectious disease. And yet, most of our research, I would say probably at least 80%, 90% of our research is focused on communicable diseases. Whereas we have growing rates of cancer, cardiometabolic diseases, and others. So I began to ask, there was a clear need to broaden the research base. So Yamachi is actually designed to be a company that is operational in Africa. And that is partly why Yamachi began to focus on the African genome. Because I wanted to almost make it impossible for anyone to force me, any investor or anybody to force me to move my operations elsewhere. So that is how we began focusing on African genome. Cancer, obvious reasons. Africa has one of the fastest growing cancer rates in the world. We have one of the highest mortality to incidence ratios, which means if you get cancer in Africa, you most likely die.
Yeah.
That is not the case in Europe and North America. There are many reasons for this, but part of the reason is a lack of understanding of cancer among the African population. There's a huge disparity in data. Most data is of people of European ancestry. Even in the United States, people of African descent bear a disproportionate burden of mortality. Black women, 40% more likely to die of breast cancer than white women in the US. Black men, twice as likely to die from prostate cancer than white men in the US. Now, of course, there are social determinants that contribute to these disparities, but even when you separate those out, within the science itself, there is a biasing that has happened. There is a lack of representation. The newest drugs do not always work as well for non-white populations as they do. So there is a need to rebalance that by bringing more African data.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Tell us a little bit about the AMBER study, and especially why it's crucial for Black women, both on the continent and also beyond.
Oh, great. I think the AMBER study is emblematic, or is a great example of why Yamachi's work, or I believe Yamachi's work is so important. So the AMBER study was the very first project Yamachi really embarked upon within the oncology space. It was a collaboration with Lucence Health, which is a California, Palo Alto-based liquid biopsy or diagnostic company. They specialize on making advanced diagnostic tools for cancer. Unfortunately, many of these tools are not available in Africa.
Oh, wow.
So the AMBER study was a relatively small study where we wanted to see how useful would this advanced blood-based diagnostic test be in a predominantly in an all African population, because they hadn't really used it very much. In the US, most of the research and most of the people in trials or anything like that are people of European descent. From their perspective, they wanted to get as much evidence to show that it would work well in Black people, because they are cutting into the US market, and the US market is increasingly, more and more diverse, let's put it that way. So from their perspective, it would be great to be able to demonstrate that their technology performed well in Black people. From our perspective, we wanted to say, can it be deployed in Ghana, and can it be useful? So we enrolled women with breast cancer, collected samples, both tissue and blood samples from these women, after consent, of course, and then analyzed it using Lucence's liquid biopsy.
And forgive my naivety, just a little bit, liquid biopsy, what are we currently using?
So traditionally a biopsy is when they insert a needle or they cut out a bit of tissue. So insert a needle into the tumor, whether it's a breast or wherever it might be, and you take a small piece of tissue that a pathologist will then analyze to tell you whether or not it is indeed cancer or something else.
Yeah.
So that's what a biopsy. A biopsy is basically a sampling method where you
tissue.
take a bit of tissue.
Okay.
Now, depending on where the tumor is, or biopsies can be challenging. They also are a bit, obviously, they are painful. They involve a bit, it's a bit traumatic for the patient, depending on where it is and how much tissue is taken. A liquid biopsy is, over the last few years, there's been more push to just use blood because taking a blood sample is the easiest sample to take. So that's what we call a liquid biopsy, is a blood sample that is trying to still give you information about the tumor. Because the truth is, tumors shed DNA into our bloodstream, and then when you collect that blood, you can sometimes detect it. So there are a number of companies in the US that are really advancing this, because if you could, imagine if you could get it really sensitive, we could all get a yearly blood test and we'd know whether or not we have cancer
or not.
You don't have to,
Interesting.
So this was a tool that had been developed by Lucens, and then we, in the AMBER study, we basically used it with a number of women who had breast cancer. And we got very promising results. We showed that blood testing had some advantages over tissue because of how the material was handled and how the integrity was maintained. So in a lower resource setting, where tissue collection can be challenging, blood offered a useful alternative. But also we found that these women had actionable mutations that actually have new drugs. Now, the other side of the equation is we now need to advocate for those drugs to be made available in the African context, because many of those drugs are not available in Africa.
Yeah.
But oftentimes, when you advocate for drugs, the first retort you get is, well, there's no adequate testing. Like, you cannot test to identify who needs the drug, so why should we make the drug available? We demonstrate that we can do that now.
You can do the test.
So we can identify patients. So now you have a bit more leverage to now say we need those drugs to now be available in Africa. I think the most important thing is it demonstrates that you can do this level of molecular biology, oncology in Africa.
Right.
So I see it as a stake in the ground to demonstrate that it is possible. And now we look to do larger and larger studies, obviously, to hopefully really, truly redefine the landscape of oncology in Africa.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sorry, COVID is always a key topic. I think it was such a significant moment in time for the entire world, not even just the continent. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about another fascinating study by Yamachi, that involved Ghanaians and the immunological response to COVID. So maybe touch a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the beauty of scientific capacity and platforms is when you build them, you can apply them to different problems.
Right.
BioNTech was a cancer company that ended up delivering one of the best COVID vaccines. So during COVID, at Yamachi, we also felt, well, we are a bunch of scientists. Cancer is our main focus, but COVID is here now. What can we do about COVID? And so we developed a project focusing on the immune response. So once again, there's very little understanding about how African people respond to vaccines. We get administered vaccines, but there's good evidence that vaccines don't always work as well in our context as they work elsewhere. Now, I need to be very careful. This is not talking about injury. I'm very pro-vax. I'm not anti-vax at all, so I just want to make that clear. But there is evidence that vaccines are not always as effective in our populations as they are in Europe. And that is really, once again, a factor of not as much research being done involving our people. So COVID presented a unique opportunity where, because of the pandemic and the shortage of vaccines, the same vaccines that were used in the UK were being used in Ghana. And that rarely ever happens. And so we felt there was an opportunity to really drill down into what really is the mechanism of how people respond to a vaccine. And are there differences based on where you live?
Yeah.
And could we then use that information to make better vaccines for our context? And so this is a study funded by the Gates Foundation. We call it the Heritage Study. And we're partnering with colleagues at the CRIC in London to compare a UK population with a Ghanaian population. And so we enrolled 300 volunteers who were getting vaccinated, and we've really done a detailed characterization of their response. The study is ongoing, so we're still working on analyzing. The first publication should be out by the end of this year. And we've already found, some interesting things. For instance, we found that people in Ghana were already, before they got vaccinated, because they got vaccines later on, had already been exposed to many of them had already been exposed to the virus.
Yeah.
But actually that pre-exposure actually may have actually contributed to a more lasting vaccine response. So many of them actually maintained levels of protection in the absence of boosting, because they'd already got some exposure. So we're still, passing through. That paper should be out, like I said, by the end of the year. And then we're continuing to now really drill into the molecular basis. But we think it was a unique opportunity, a once in a lifetime opportunity. And we hope that the data we generate over the next few years will form a key component of our understanding of vaccine responses in a West African, population. And that information can then be fed into ongoing vaccine development efforts to really ensure that we develop vaccines that are truly optimized for African populations and therefore hopefully much more effective.
Where do you hope to see Yamachi in a few years, maybe 5 years down the road?
In 5 years, I hope Yamachi would have established itself as the primary African biotech focused on oncology. We want to be the partner for global pharma in diversifying precision oncology. Global pharma is under pressure to diversify, partly because populations in their big markets like the US and Europe are rapidly diversifying. And so as those populations diversify, pharma is under pressure to ensure that their research base and the drugs and tools they develop are effective in a broader range of people than they've ever had to before. The US FDA is now requiring that clinical trials need 20% non-white participation. So they're already under pressure.
Time.
It is.
Yeah.
My hope is Yamachi can make the case successfully that the African continent is a key part is a key solution to that problem, or a key part of the solution. The African continent is the most genetically diverse population on the planet. Homo sapiens, our human species, evolved from Africa. And then after, a couple 100,000 years, a few people decided to migrate into other parts of the globe. And so that evolutionary history means that African diversity is really largely reflective of global diversity. And the diversity you find outside of Africa is often a subset of what's in Africa. And so the African continent, which has currently been largely excluded from sequencing efforts and studies on human genetics, actually may hold the key to understanding understanding human health across the world. And so my hope is, at least for cancer, Yamachi can successfully make the case for inclusion of African data in global pharmaceutical oncology research. And I think the pathway to doing that is to demonstrate that the quality of data that we generate from the African continent is on par with any data that can be generated in Europe and North America. So that's our role. Yamachi's role is to demonstrate African excellence and to demonstrate that Africa has something to contribute.
Right.
And it's not anywhere inferior. It is highly useful, and it is, I would say, pharma grade or, pharma quality data. So in 5 years, I hope we've made that case. And if we can successfully do that, then the world, the global pharma begins to look at Africa less as a charity case, less as a place where we need to do some CSR, but really as a place where there is opportunities and there is rationale from a business perspective to invest. Because we need to present Africa as a place where people can do business and make money.
Yeah.
But we can only do that when African businesses rise up, demonstrate some success, and attract people's attention to the continent in a whole different way than the current more aid-based, philanthropic-based approaches that many of us in Africa are used to.
It's one thing to demonstrate investment opportunities. It's another thing to show that potential is on the continent. And I think
can be realized.
You are a great example. Yamachi is a fantastic, setup. The fact that you can set up an oncology, a cancer biotech that really solving our problems on the continent, and also just, developing the infrastructure to make sure that it's not only dealing with one disease. You straddled into COVID. You've looked at that. And I think, it's very clear and it's very important to you that African innovators are beginning to set their own agendas. One of the things that we were fascinated by is the fact that for you, even when you talk about the charity case, by mere fact of establishing Yamachi and going out and looking for investors, you not only went to the global north, as we like to call it, you also reached out to the African diaspora. The first wallet that was opened was by the African diaspora.
Yep.
I think I want to start winding up the podcast and just really say congratulations on your recent 25 million or so it was. And maybe in just a few words, talk a little bit about that opportunity that Yamachi has found itself in. When you were saying 5 years from now where you see yourself, I see that coming sooner than later. So just a little bit about that grant, what that looks like, what that opens up in terms of doors.
No, thank you. I mean, yes, we were fortunate to be part of a Cancer Grant Challenge Award. Yes, 25 million, but I always tell people, that doesn't mean Yamachi is receiving 25 million. We are part of a large consortium. It's a very ambitious project focused on understanding cancers in Black people, so breast cancer, prostate cancer, pancreatic cancer. It's led by Melissa Davis from Morehouse University, which is actually a historically Black college university in Atlanta. And so, yeah, that project called the Sambai project really is reflective of a recognition by the NIH, who are co-funding this grant, that there needs to be something big done about the inequities of cancer. What excites me is the inclusion of Yamachi in Sambai demonstrates that to solve US inequity, there is a need to include the continent.
Right.
And during the process of creating, applying for the grant, we refer to this as a redemptive arc, that African genomes of African people, African women with breast cancer in Africa, would contribute towards improving the healthcare, not just of theirs, but of their sisters who were descendants of slaves taken a long time ago.
Makes
and
sense.
the fact that it's, in my mind, I see these, these armies of, coming to redeem our sisters, right, from the continent. And I think that's a really important narrative that we cannot overlook, because as a proud African, I am frustrated by the image of Africa that is portrayed in media, that Africa is impoverished and Africa has all these problems. Yes, we have some of these issues, but Africa is more than its problems. And I think what I was excited about with Sambai was it was a recognition that there was something useful in Africa that would help people in a developed country, help people in America, help people in Europe. And as I said, yes, it's $25 million, but it's spread over a lot of groups. But I think it identifies and it recognizes the importance of collaboration. It identifies the importance of involving the African continent when discussing health disparities in advanced in high-income countries like the United States.
So Yao, how do you plan to maintain creative control and ensure African innovators set the agenda as you attract more and more foreign investments? And also, I was wondering, I was intrigued to, I was almost inquiring when I asked you about your long-term plan. I wanted to find out, are you interested in selling Yamachi in the near future? Because we've seen that with a lot of startups on the continent, where you have young people who come up with great, fantastic ideas, companies, and then suddenly they're bought over by big pharma or big enterprises.
Well, when you have a startup, you have investors. Investors need to get a return. So you talk about exits. There are a variety of ways that we could potentially exit. The two main ones are through an acquisition, yes, or through a public listing. We're not there yet, so it's not something I've given too much thought to. I think your earlier question about as we are looking to attract more and more investment, and a lot of the larger investments will come from outside the continent, as much as we hope to be able to attract some from the continent. I think maintaining control, the pathway we've taken is to center our African identity in the value of the company. If you remove the Africanness of Yamachi from Yamachi, Yamachi is not Yamachi anymore.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, it loses the value. So what we are trying to do is demonstrate that what makes Yamachi, why somebody should want to pay lots of money to acquire Yamachi perhaps one day, is because Yamachi is African. And because our agenda is informed by the community. What gives us an advantage, what makes us valuable to our farmer partners is our understanding of the continent. My team is made up of highly skilled professionals, many of whom have trained at some of the best institutions around the world. But what they also have is real life experience as professionals in Africa. Whether they are scientists or business people or engineers, they have each spent at least a decade working in the trenches on the continent. And that gives us a huge advantage and is of huge value to a large pharma company who wants to partner with us. So as we engage with investors, we make it very clear that this is what makes us special. This is why you actually want to invest. Because you want to invest in a business that has potential to make you a good return. Yamachi's potential to succeed and so be a good investment opportunity is inextricably linked to its identity as an African-based company, its identity as a company that wants to benefit the local community. And so that is how I when I have discussions and investors push me on certain things we want to do, I make it very clear that, look, if we don't do these things, we lose our connection to the community that supports us, and all of a sudden, Yamachi is just like any other foreign entity, and we will be unable to deliver what we set out to do. Africa needs its own Roche, Merck, Pfizer, other biotech, other pharma companies exist. Africa needs one.
And when we talk about change, one of the other things we could consider is, you're talking about population, so more than 1 billion people. I mean, Yamachi, you need to look at crowdfunding mechanisms where, also the African population can contribute.
Yes, an M-Pesa drive.
An M-Pesa drive.
Yeah.
We're good culturally. We're good at this.
If any of your listeners want to send me M-Pesa, they can do so. I mean, no, we would like, like I said, as much as we have raised money from outside the continent, the diaspora, which I consider to be an extension of the continent, is what got us started, like you said in the beginning. We have raised some money from funds in Africa. And we are trying to make the case for why biotech is an important investment for African investors. It is currently not on the top of their minds because biotech is quite a niche area, even for US investors. And we do need the emergence. African science needs the emergence of African funds focused on biotech. Maybe I hope that the little success of Yamachi and hopefully growing success of Yamachi will inspire that as well. So when you talk about the ecosystem, it's not about the companies. You also need the investors.
Right.
You need the capital to expand. You need access to that kind of, those resources. But they tend to go hand in hand.
And it will happen. We are here to help you get that visibility and that drive. So earlier in the podcast, you talked about Professor Gordon Awandure, who's at the University of Ghana. On the podcast, we do have a segment about top African scientists who inspire you. So maybe 2 of them very quickly. Who are they? Where are they based? And why do you look up to them?
Oh, wow. Now you're like putting me on the spot. Well, you've already mentioned Gordon, and he's my most immediate boss before I start working for myself. So I should, all respect to Gordon. I think what he's built at WACBIP, the vision he had for WACBIP, attracting people like me. I would not have probably come back to Ghana if it wasn't for the vision of WACBIP. So that gave me a line of sight.
WACBIP stands for?
WACBIP is the West African Center for Cell Biology of Infectious Pathogens, which is a World Bank Center of Excellence within the University of Ghana, funded by Professor Awandare. There are many really talented African scientists. I will not mention any of Michael Esso's Juma Fellows because people would think that I'm just, but all of them, I'll just put it out there in case they listen to this.
Yeah.
Tumi Nungu is somebody who I also have immense respect for. And what both Tumi and Gordon have in common is their willingness to mentor young scientists and share some of their spotlight. It's not an easy thing to do when you're also trying to build. But what they've both demonstrated very clearly is an ability to step slightly to the side and let the young people who they are leading also emerge. And so I really respect that, and I hope it's something that I can also emulate in giving platform, sharing my platform with young up-and-coming scientists from the continent to also begin to get visibility. So those two would stand out as people that I really admire as providing opportunities. I'm sure once we stop filming, there'll be more that will pop into my head, but I'm happy with those two.
I know I was going to put you further on the spot and say, no women inspiring.
I knew you were going to say that. No, I mean, Iruka, I mean, like I said, my CJ fellows, Iruka, Isabella, Mainga, Ife, Annette, all of them are really, Anita, Nikki, Joanne, there you go. I think I listed all of them.
Yeah.
Are all very, very powerful, and I just didn't want to go into the CJ fellows because I think they're all very inspirational people. I was trying to think of people outside of that.
No, and that's
let me
fine.
think
No
of
pressure.
another. I mean, in my own journey, I have been mentored by women. They're just not African women, but I think I would like to give a shout out to them as well.
Yes.
So my PhD supervisor Chang Ru Wang, who's from Taiwan, based at Northwestern, who is the reason I'm an immunologist, and then Jean Langhorn, who was my postdoc supervisor at the Crick, who gave me the freedom to actually move to Ghana whilst I was still working in her lab. And she allowed me to spend many months in Kenya and also many months in Ghana as she recognized I needed to transition. And so those are two women who I would not be where I am without them. They happen not to be African women, but I mean, my mother is a British woman anyway. So yes, I should shout out to those two. And then of course, Kevin Marsh, for letting me come back to Africa in the first place at the very, very beginning.
So as we wrap up, the recurring segment on our show is always to explore what scares you and what excites you about our world today. It doesn't have to be in immunology or in cancer or in health or science. It could be broader than that. You could be fascinated by AI, for example.
I'm scared by how fractured the world is. You just turn on your TV and it's people fighting with people othering people, people not respecting others. It happens on our continent. It happens outside the UK recently with all these race riots. It's scary. It's a little bit confusing. It's like, where is the leadership? Where is that voice? On the continent, we are also somewhat divided. And so that I think that's probably scares many people. It's something that you don't expect to see in the 21st century, and yet it seems like more and more nationalistic pride is overtaking our common values as human beings. So that is something at a very general level, but also a personal level that quite worries me quite a bit. What excites me though, once again, is when I meet every time I meet young African scientists, doctors. I was just from a conference in Mombasa, and I was swarmed by these young people who, have heard about Yamachi, and they're excited because they're believing that Africa can do stuff. And it's not because of Yamachi, but it's just an example. But that excites me because they come from very diverse backgrounds. So it's really interesting how you see that kind of unity among these young people who haven't yet really decided what they want to be yet and are still in training, but they have so much hope, and they have such energy, and I think that gives me hope. So in a world that is fractured, an Africa that is faced with so many challenges, the young people are still our best hope, and the young people are, if nothing, they are better than they were. I mean, I look at them compared to where I was at their age, and I'm like, wow. I mean, we are seeing progress. So that gives me hope that there's this growing, there's this mass of people who are passionate about the continent, and believe that there can be a different future from the one that we currently in. So that excites me, and I think we just need to create an environment for these people to show us what they can do. And it behooves those of us who are in leadership or aspiring to be leaders or whatever, slightly ahead of them in that journey, to not dampen their enthusiasm, but in fact find ways to be allies to enhance, because they are the ones who are going to chart that new future, and we need to recognize that. We need to open the way for them. So those are the things that I think about.
Okay. Call to action?
Well, I think in line with everything I've said before, Africa has problems. Africa needs help. But Africa needs help from within. No one is going to solve our problems for us. No white knight is going to ride in to save us. And so we need to do the hard work. We need, as African scientists, we need to be critical of ourselves. We need to make sure that our science is as good as we can make it. And we need to believe that we can pull ourselves out of whatever situation that we find ourselves in. So I think that the onus on all of us as scientists, as Africans, is to whine less and organize more, and believe that the future that we all aspire to, the Africa that we want, is within our grasp, but we're going to have to reach out. And we're going to have to be intentional, and we're going to have to work really hard to achieve it. But if we do that, I believe that we will arrive at the future and the vision that many of us aspire to. But it's going to take hard work, and so we need to be willing to put what we need. We need to be willing to put work in. And so, yes, I think the call to action is pick up your pipette, pick up your hammer, pick up whatever tool of your trade, and march forward. Don't wait for someone to do it for you. Do it for yourself, do it for your continent, do it for your family, and do it for the world. Because Africa's success is the world's success. If Africa doesn't succeed, the world is a less complete place. But we have to do it for ourselves.
Dr. Bediako, on the wall at Yemachi Biotech in Ghana, Accra, are the words of Thomas Sankara, Dare to Invent the Future.
Yep.
I think for us here at Connecting the Dots podcast, you have brought the future to the continent. We wish you well on your path. We're excited to see what you're going to establish. And it's exciting for us to see that you're not doing it just alone. The mere fact that you're referencing a conference you were at recently, and to see the excitement around you, and the fact that Yemachi is in the mouths of a lot of Africans. You know, there's hope, there's inspiration that you're bringing. And I think this also goes beyond the continent. It actually goes to the African diaspora as well. So keep doing what you're doing. We're here to champion you on, and we're excited for the future that you'll bring to us.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for tuning in to Connecting the Dots podcast, created by me, Juliet. This episode was brought to life by Mumbua and Kevin at Silent Global in Nairobi, Kenya. If you enjoyed this episode, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it. Tag us on CTD Pod Africa on all platforms. Keep the conversation going. Let us know what you'd love to hear about, and join me on the next episode as I interview the next amazing scientist here on Connecting the Dots podcast.